Hello guys and welcome back. Today we are under the patrol because today we're going to be talking about the different suspensions that you can get for the Y62 Patrol and why you may need a certain type of suspension depending on what you're going to be doing with your vehicle. Alright, so before we kick off, we sort of need to understand what suspension the Y62 Patrol has. Before 2013, the Y62 Patrols had a conventional suspension setup that you would see in most four-wheel drives of that time period. The 2013 Patrols and earlier had a conventional live axle suspension setup with, springs and struts, or shock absorbers, and a live axle with sway bars. So it was very conventional and quite normal, and works quite well. That's been proven on those generation of Patrols ever since they were first introduced, that they were a really great bulletproof suspension setup that worked very well. After 2013, Nissan decided to go to this HBMC system, which is good but does have its limitations. So obviously it's IRS and IFS, so it has independent front and rear suspension setup. So it has lower control arms, upper control arms. Obviously the HBMC suspension itself, which is this strut here, and it also has springs in the rear. So one of the benefits of HBMC is obviously ground clearance. So we have a differential which then goes into CVs, which then drives the wheels. So that there is a CV which comes out of obviously the diff. So there's no real diff pumpkin or anything that can be hung up. There's no sway bars, there's nothing like that that can interfere with any sort of ground clearance. So that's one of the benefits. One of the downsides is, though, that CVs are weak, especially on a Patrol with this sort of weight and power. It's very easy for CVs to break, so that's a bit of a shame, but if you're doing hard wheeling, you're going to carry spares so that you can replace them if something does go wrong. Now, as you can see on my Patrol, I have hit the lower control arms on a few things. That one over there is a bit worse. That one copped it on some rocks, so yeah, it's just something to keep in mind, that these also do give you a little bit less ground clearance as well, but it's not like in the middle of the car, it's more so on the sides, and these will lift as the wheels go up and down, so it's not so bad. This is basically a system that runs on hydraulic pressure and hydraulic fluid, which means that you can do away without a sway bar. So this helps to obviously not only work as a conventional shock absorber, but it also helps to stop body roll. And if you have driven a Patrol with HBMC, you'll know that they do actually a pretty good job, and the ride is quite comfortable. But if you're more of an old school sort of person who likes a live axle setup, then you probably won't want to go for a Patrol, over Series 3. Maybe Series 2, not quite sure if Series 2 had the HBMC. But you want to look at an old Patrol that has the more conventional style setup. So for those people running the HBMC, what sort of options are there for suspension? Now, there's a couple of options that you can do to either lift your Patrol or to modify the suspension itself. So for a lot of people that are towing, they'll just leave the HBMC system alone, and then you can upgrade your springs. Now, why would you want to upgrade your springs? So the reason you'd want to upgrade your springs is because the stock springs are obviously designed for comfort, not so much towing or massive loads. So this in turn will allow the car to squat down when it is loaded up, putting a lot of pressure on your rear tyres and other suspension components, which can sort of lead to premature wear of not only tyres but bushings and that sort of thing as well. So that is basically the reason why you want to lift your suspension by getting heavier springs. This will help to increase your tyre life, as tyres are quite expensive, especially if you're on 35s. So you want to make sure you can maximise your tyre life, because a lot of people have gone for a decently long trip and come back and their tyres are pretty much down to the wear indicators after one trip, after having fairly new tyres. So you don't want to run into those sort of issues, especially when you're loading these cars up with equipment, gear and people, and also adding that ball weight on the rear of the car. Accessories is also a big thing as well. If you're putting a bull bar and winch and stuff on the front of the car, that is also going to weigh the front of the car down. So not only do you want to upgrade the rear springs, but as well as the front, to ensure that you have an equal ride height across the whole car. Now there's plenty of options out there from all the big manufacturers, Dobinson's, Old Man Emu, all them sort of big brands are doing springs for the Patrols, and they come in a lot of varying kilos of weight that you could be putting into your Patrol. So 200, 400, so you sort of need to weigh your stuff and to give you a rough indication of what size spring you should be running, which will help with those things that I mentioned before. Another thing to look at if you are towing or you've got a lot of weight in the rear of the car is airbags. Now, what is the point of an airbag? Well, airbags basically go in between the spring, which helps the spring not droop as much when you have it loaded up. So basically there is lines that run into the airbags, and you can pump them up to whichever PSI suits to make sure that the ride height of the car is level across the front and rear. And this is another method to sort of help the spring not compress as much and do premature wear to components of the vehicle. It's probably recommended to do both a heavier spring as well as airbags, just to maximize the effectiveness of the ride changes that you do. So especially if you're doing big trips, lots of weight, towing caravan or something like that, it's definitely a good move to look into something like that. Now, what if you want to do a lot of forward driving and want to lift the car? Well, there is a couple of options, although they are somewhat difficult to do. But a lot of mechanics and stuff are now getting on board with the Y62s and how to actually modify them. So there's a lot of good workshops out there nowadays that can help with fitting up suspension and stuff nowadays. You also need specialised tools and stuff to do it as well. So taking it to a mechanic and you're doing suspension stuff is probably a good move. So OnTrack do a HBMC lift, which basically changes out the weak lower control arms that are a little bit on the weak side, just because due to the construction and the material used, it's a bit thin. So basically what it is a new lower control arm, and you can also choose your spring rate as well for how many kilos you're going to have in the car. And basically it adds on another bracket down in here where the HBMC would mount to help lift it higher. So the bracket actually sits up higher and can give you a 2-inch lift. So that's one of the options. And I'd also look at doing an upper control arm upgrade as well, just so you can have the adjustability when it comes to do a wheel alignment, because the more adjustability you have, the easier it is to get your alignment spot on. Which is a big thing in Patrols. So there's a couple of things that you need to look at when you're coming to do an upgrade for your suspension on your Patrol. Just do your research, find what's right for you. Yeah, the Patrols can be a little bit finicky when it comes to suspension stuff, and they have to be done by a qualified mechanic who knows what they're doing when it comes to working on these cars, because the last thing you want is something like this not being 100% and having drivability issues, because obviously the Patrol drives very nicely as it sits. Okay, so we've moved to the front of the car now, and as you can see, there's our bump stops there, and you can see that there's not a heap of travel before the bump stop is hitting on the this bracket here. So you can get different bump stops, which is included in the OnTrack Lift, and as you can see there, that's the little bracket that the HBMC sits in. So that's a strut right there with the spring and shock absorber in one. So you can see there that that's where the HBMC bolts up to the lower control arm. So basically the OnTrack Lift gives you a larger bracket for it to sit in, which gives you about 50 mil of a lift, which, you know, roughly 2 inches. So that's what you're sort of looking at for lifts in these. It is a little bit difficult, and that kit does require someone to install that that actually knows what they're doing, because you know, bushings can be a little bit tricky, and you need to actually, you know what you're doing. Been nothing but good things said about that lift, and people are saying that, you know, it drives nicer than stock, so it must do the job. And also you have that upgraded lower control arm as well, which is stronger. And up there's your upper control arm, and you can see sort of how, you know, that's just been mass produced and designed to not really be as strong as it could be. So that would be a good upgrade to do as well. Those are sort of the options that you have, and the reasons why you'd want to upgrade your suspension in your Patrol. Now, if you don't like the HBMC system and you want to sort of go for a more conventional suspension setup, you can. So you can remove all the HBMC and put in a conventional suspension system, although you need to add sway bars, and you also need to get it engineered, because obviously you're drastically changing a component of the vehicle, which will need to have an engineer certificate to ensure that it complies with you know, standards and is safe to drive on the road. So the vehicle will have to undergo a swerve test to ensure that, you know, it's not going to fall over in the case of an emergency or something like that where you need to swerve. You can get rid of all this stuff and, you know, go back to a conventional system, which, you know, of course is going to work well, but that's a lot of money and effort to, you know, remove something that does do a decent job as it sits. So, you know, it depends on how hardcore you want to go with your build, but that is also an option out there. You can also run dual suspension as well, retaining the HBMC and also adding remote res shock absorbers. So that's also another option, but that does include a lot of modifications to upper and lower control arms to make that work. But you can imagine just how nice that would be to drive off-road, and it would soak up the bumps very nicely. So there is a couple of options for suspension, and it really just does depend on how crazy you want to go with your car and, you know, what your goals are for it. For those people that may be a bit unaware, these are remote reservoir shock absorbers, which can be a great upgrade for people with older Patrols who don't have the HBMC suspension. So these are remote res, as I said. So they have this reservoir here, which is full of hydraulic fluid, and obviously, you know, very same principle, or very similar, sorry, to how the HBMC is. Obviously, when the suspension does hit a bump, it'll obviously move up and push the fluid out of the actual shock down into the reservoir, and then you know, as it comes back down, the fluid comes back and pushes the suspension down. These are great, really comfortable, very well designed. There's plenty of different things on the market. You can get, you know, really fancy ones that have like triple bypass reservoirs and stuff that are great for you know, really like Baja sort of stuff, where you can get these ones which are a little bit more budget friendly but still great, and also offer a heap of adjustability for your spring rates and dampening and that sort of thing. Your shock rates, sorry. So these ones are out of a GU, although, you know, it's the same principle across the board for, you know, remote res shocks. So yeah, very similar sort of design to the HBMC, but obviously just doesn't have that reservoir like connected like this configuration here. Now, like I did mention before, you can run a dual suspension setup with these and the HBMC, although obviously there's a lot of modification and stuffing around with that sort of a setup. So yeah, I just thought I'd show you this so you can have a bit of an understanding of the different suspension setups that are out there. These are made by Pro Fender, but there's a lot of good brands out there like Kings. There's also Fox Shocks. They're one of the really popular ones, and there's plenty of others out there as well that do a good setup like this. Obviously these do need to be serviced quite regularly. I haven't really heard anything servicing wise with the HBMC, although I'm sure you probably should, because obviously these have seals in them that stop the oil from leaking out of them, and over time they do fail, and it's quite obvious to see because there'll be oil coming out of these. These ones are due for a rebuild. As you can see, there's a little bit of oil coming out of them. They were going to go into my GQ Patrol, but I sold it before I had the chance. These are remote res, and you can obviously see the similarities between the HBMC and these ones. Guys, that'll do today's video. I hope you have a better understanding of the suspension setups available for the Patrols, and why you should consider a suspension type for your Patrol if you're looking at doing something that's other than dropping the kids off at school. Unfortunately, we didn't get to do the video that I was promising on Friday. We ran into a little technical difficulty, but do not stress. That video will be coming in a couple of weeks' time. I'm very excited about it because it's going to be really cool. Stay tuned for that one. It's going to be quite good. Something a little bit different. Doesn't really have anything to do with the Patrol, but it's going to be cool nonetheless. So that's going to do it for today's video, guys. I hope you have enjoyed and learnt something. Patrol's a very different animal when it comes to modifications and upgrading. They're a little bit difficult, a bit fiddly and temperamental when it comes to things, so they have to be done 100% right. For me, I'm probably not going to touch the suspension stuff on this myself. It'll be taken to a mechanic that has experience with the Patrols, because I want it to have it 100%, and I don't really have experience with HBMC as it's relatively new on the market, although the concept of it still has been around for quite some time. So thanks for watching, guys. Make sure you like, comment and subscribe if you are new. A lot of you guys aren't subscribed yet, so it would make my day to have you guys jump on board and never miss the action and the information that I provide for Patrol owners, as there's a lot of convoluting information out there, and I try and bring you the facts and knowledge that is accurate, so you guys can make an informed decision about the stuff that you do on your Patrol. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and I will see you at the next video.